Hey guys, tonight we begin a very long trip. Not an exciting trip, not a fast one, certainly not a well-organized one, just a very long, slightly damp, frequently delayed journey home. This is the entire story of Odysseus, told calmly and without heroic shouting. And before we set sail at the speed of a tired sea turtle, remember to quietly subscribe if you enjoy this kind of sleepy history. It helps more than a favorable wind from the west. Now, Odysseus was the king of Ithaca, a small rocky island in the Ionian Sea. Not the biggest kingdom, not the richest. Just enough goats, a palace with decent stonework, and a view of the water that probably looked very poetic at sunset. He was known for being clever, not necessarily the strongest Greek hero. That would be Achilles, who preferred dramatic sulking. But Odysseus was clever in the way that makes other people slightly nervous. The kind of man who looks at a problem and immediately starts thinking about loopholes. His troubles truly begin with the Trojan War. If you remember, this whole war started because Paris of Troy made a very questionable romantic decision. Thousands of ships were launched, spears were thrown, armor was dented, and for 10 years the Greeks and Trojans fought in what must have been an extremely exhausting stalemate. Odysseus, instead of charging dramatically into danger every 5 minutes, mostly survived by thinking. It was Odysseus who came up with the idea of the Trojan horse, a large wooden horse, hollow inside, full of armed men, a gift, supposedly. The Trojans, after a decade of war, looked at this giant wooden animal and thought, yes, this seems reasonable. They rolled it into the city, they went to bed, and during the night, Odysseus and his friends climbed out and opened the gates. Troy fell, history moved forward, and Odysseus probably felt quite pleased with himself. Now, this is where things should have been simple. War over, time to go home, have dinner, see his wife Penelope, maybe sit down. Unfortunately, Greek mythology does not reward early relaxation. Instead, Odysseus and his crew began what would become a 10-year detour. The first stop was the land of the Cicones. A quick raid, some looting, nothing unusual for Bronze Age sailors. But they stayed too long. Reinforcements arrived, men were lost. Already, this is not a promising start. Next came the Lotus Eaters, a place where the locals offered fruit that made you forget everything, home, responsibilities, the concept of time. Some of Odysseus's men ate the lotus and immediately decided they were quite happy lying around forever. Odysseus had to drag them back to the ships, which is less epic than it sounds. Imagine trying to move very relaxed adults who do not want to leave a picnic. Then came the Cyclopes, specifically Polyphemus, a large one-eyed shepherd with a very minimal approach to interior decoration. Odysseus and his men entered his cave. They helped themselves to cheese. Polyphemus returned. He blocked the exit with a rock the size of a small house. And then, regrettably, he began eating them, one by one, slowly, which must have made the cave feel quite cramped. Odysseus, being clever, introduced himself as nobody. He offered the Cyclops wine, strong wine. Polyphemus drank it, became sleepy, and when he passed out, Odysseus and the remaining men sharpened a wooden stake and blinded him. When other Cyclopes heard the screams and asked who was hurting him, Polyphemus replied, "Nobody," and they, logically, left him alone. It was a solid plan. They escaped by clinging to the undersides of sheep, which is not glamorous. And just when everything seemed fine, Odysseus made a small mistake. He shouted his real name back at the Cyclopes while sailing away, just to take credit. Polyphemus, unfortunately, was the son of Poseidon, god of the sea, and Poseidon does not appreciate public embarrassment. From that moment forward, the ocean became less cooperative. Storms, shipwrecks, sudden detours. Odysseus had offended the literal personification of water, and water, as you may know, is quite difficult to argue with. They met Aeolus, keeper of the winds, who generously gave Odysseus a bag containing all unfavorable winds, neatly tied. He said essentially, "Don't open this." Odysseus did not open it. His crew did. They assumed it contained treasure. They untied it while Odysseus slept. The winds escaped. The ships were blown off course again. It is at this point that you begin to sense a pattern, and this, gently, is only the beginning. We have not yet discussed Circe, or the underworld, or the Sirens, or the cattle of Helios, which absolutely should not have been eaten. But for now, imagine the sea stretching endlessly in every direction, a small fleet of tired ships, a king who only wanted to go home, and a god of the ocean quietly making sure that he would not arrive any time soon. The sea, at this point, was no longer simply water. It was a personality problem, and Odysseus, who had once outsmarted a city with a wooden horse, was now discovering that waves do not negotiate. After the unfortunate wind incident, the fleet drifted toward the land of the Laestrygonians, which sounds charming. It was not. The Laestrygonians were giants, not philosophical giants, not gentle shepherd giants, the sort who see a fleet of ships and think, "Lunch!" They hurled massive rocks down from cliffs, crushing ships like mildly inconvenient pottery. All but one vessel was destroyed. Odysseus, wisely, had anchored his ship slightly apart from the others, which saved him. It also meant he now had far fewer men to manage. This would not improve morale. With only one ship remaining, they arrived at the island of Circe. Circe was a sorceress. She lived in a house in the forest. There were animals around her home that behaved with suspicious politeness. Some of Odysseus's men entered her hall. She offered them food and drink. They accepted, and then she turned them into pigs. Not metaphorically, literally pigs. When the news reached Odysseus, he prepared to confront her. On the way, he was met by Hermes, who handed him a magical herb to protect against Circe's spells, a small botanical intervention. Odysseus entered the house, drank the potion, did not turn into livestock. Circe was impressed, which is a common reaction to Odysseus. After some discussion, calm, strategic discussion, she restored his men to human form. And then, in a decision that feels both understandable and unwise, Odysseus and his crew stayed on Circe's island for an entire year. A year, eating well, resting, possibly forgetting that Ithaca existed. It was comfortable, too comfortable. Eventually, the men gently reminded their king that they did, in fact, have homes. Odysseus agreed. Circe, now less adversarial and more advisory, told him that before returning home, he would need to visit the underworld. This is not normally included in standard travel itineraries. To reach the land of the dead, Odysseus sailed to the edge of the world, where the sun rarely visits. He performed the required rituals, poured libations, spoke the names of the departed, and the spirits gathered, pale, whispering, eager for blood offering so they could speak clearly. He met the prophet Tiresias, who informed him calmly that the journey home would continue to be unpleasant, He would lose all his men. He must not harm the sacred cattle of Helios. And even if he reached Ithaca, things would not be simple. This was less prophecy and more an extended warning label. Odysseus also encountered the spirit of his mother, who had died while waiting for him. She told him Penelope remained faithful. She also gently confirmed that 20 years is a long time to wait. Odysseus tried to embrace her, but his arms passed through her form, which is both tragic and very consistent with ghost-related logistics. He saw Achilles, who admitted that being dead was not as glorious as advertised. He saw Agamemnon, who warned him about trusting wives. The underworld overall was not uplifting. When Odysseus returned to the living world, the sea was still there, still watching, still mildly irritated. Next came the Sirens, creatures whose song lured sailors to crash their ships upon rocky shores. Circe had advised him carefully, "Plug your men's ears with wax. Tie yourself to the mast. Do not untie yourself no matter what you say." Odysseus followed instructions this time. The crew rowed past while he listened, straining against ropes, begging to be released. They did not release him, which is perhaps the only moment in this entire journey where the crew demonstrated perfect discipline. Then there was Scylla and Charybdis. On one side of a narrow strait lurked Scylla, a many-headed monster who plucked sailors from decks. On the other side churned Charybdis, a massive whirlpool that swallowed entire ships. The choice was between partial disaster and total disaster. Odysseus chose partial. 6 men were taken by Scylla. The ship survived. It was a calculated loss, a phrase that sounds clinical. It was not clinical. Finally, they reached the island of Helios, where sacred cattle grazed peacefully. Tiresias had been very clear. Do not touch the cattle. Do not even look at them with hunger. Unfortunately, storms trapped the crew there for a month. Food ran low. Odysseus left to pray. His men, tired and starving, decided that gods might forgive them. They slaughtered the cattle. The sun god did not forgive them. When they set sail again, Zeus sent a storm so efficient it feels administrative. Lightning struck the ship. It shattered. Every man was lost, except Odysseus. He drifted alone on wreckage, the last survivor of a journey that had begun with many voices and full sails. Now it was only him and the sea, still stretching outward, still not done with him yet. At this point, Odysseus was no longer a commander of ships. He was a man floating on debris, reconsidering several life choices. The sea had reduced his grand expedition to a single piece of timber and one very tired king. He drifted for days. The sun rose, the sun set. Poseidon, still holding a mild but persistent grudge, stirred the waves whenever possible. Odysseus eventually washed ashore on the island of Ogygia, which sounds pleasant, and in many ways it was. Ogygia belonged to Calypso, a nymph. She lived in a cave surrounded by lush forests, flowing water, and birds that probably sang in a soothing but slightly repetitive way. Calypso found Odysseus on the beach, exhausted, salt-covered, and dramatically alone. She took him in, fed him, offered him shelter, and then she offered him immortality. This is where mythology becomes complicated in a very quiet way. Calypso did not threaten him. She did not transform him into livestock. She simply loved him, or something very close to it. She offered him eternal youth, eternal life, no more storms, no more shipwrecks, no more uncomfortable conversations about cattle. All he had to do was stay. Odysseus stayed for 7 years. 7. It was not imprisonment in the traditional sense, but neither was it freedom. He walked along the shore. He looked out over the water. He thought about Ithaca, about Penelope, about the small rocky island that did not offer immortality, but did offer familiarity. Eventually, the gods held a meeting, as they often do. Athena, who had a soft spot for Odysseus's mind, argued that perhaps he had suffered enough. Zeus agreed. Hermes was dispatched to inform Calypso that she must let him go. Calypso was not thrilled. She pointed out, reasonably, that male gods often abduct mortal women without consequence. But she obeyed. She helped Odysseus build a raft, gave him supplies, watched him leave. The sea naturally noticed. Poseidon spotted the raft and decided that calm sailing was still not appropriate. A storm erupted. The raft shattered again. Odysseus once more found himself in the water, clinging to survival like it was a moderately reliable acquaintance. This time, he reached the island of the Phaeacians. He crawled onto the shore, fell asleep in a pile of leaves, which is not how most heroes prefer to be introduced. He was discovered by Nausicaa, the daughter of the king. She found him looking less like a king of Ithaca and more like a damp shrub. She offered assistance, clean clothes, directions to the palace. Odysseus, now well practiced in polite introductions, approached carefully. At the palace, he told his story, calmly, thoroughly, every island, every monster, every unfortunate decision involving livestock. The Phaeacians listened. They were impressed. And importantly, they owned very good ships. They agreed to take him home. For the first time in 20 years, Odysseus slept on a ship that was not about to be destroyed. The Phaeacian vessel moved swiftly and silently across the sea. No storms, no divine tantrums. They reached Ithaca at night and gently placed the sleeping king on the shore along with gifts. He woke up alone, again. Except this time, the coastline looked familiar. The hills, the scent of the air, the shape of the land. He had made it back. But returning home, as it turns out, is not the same as reclaiming it. Athena appeared to him, disguised at first, then revealing herself. She informed him that during his 20-year absence, many suitors had taken up residence in his palace. They were courting Penelope, eating his livestock, drinking his wine, lounging on his furniture with a confidence that suggested they had no immediate plans to leave. Penelope, remarkably, had delayed them. She promised to choose a husband once she finished weaving a burial shroud. Each night, she quietly unraveled the day's work, a small act of resistance, repeated for years. Odysseus, standing on his own island, was advised not to announce himself immediately. Instead, Athena disguised him as a beggar, wrinkled skin, worn clothes, a man no one would notice. It was, in many ways, the perfect disguise for someone who had spent years being underestimated by forces much larger than himself. He walked toward his palace, slowly, observing, planning, listening to the voices of men who believed the king would never return. The journey across the sea had finally ended, but the final task, quietly reclaiming a life, was only beginning. Odysseus, now disguised as a beggar with convincingly worn sandals and a posture that suggested mild back pain, approached his own palace as if he were visiting someone else's inconvenience. Ithaca looked mostly the same. The hills were where hills tend to remain. The goats had not overthrown anyone. But inside the palace, things were noticeably louder. The suitors had settled in comfortably. They ate at long tables. They argued. They laughed in the way people laugh when they believe consequences are theoretical. Before entering the palace, Odysseus stopped at the hut of Eumaeus, his loyal swineherd. Eumaeus did not recognize him. Instead, he offered the disguised king food and shelter without hesitation. He spoke kindly of Odysseus, assuming his master was long dead, but still worthy of respect. Odysseus listened quietly to praise about himself. It is a strange experience hearing your own obituary spoken warmly while you sit 3 feet away. Soon after, Telemachus returned. Telemachus had been a child when Odysseus left for Troy. Now he was a young man. He had grown up in a house full of uninvited guests, watching them consume his inheritance one roasted animal at a time. He had recently traveled abroad searching for news of his father, but the world offered only rumors. When Telemachus arrived at the swineherd's hut, Athena lifted Odysseus's disguise briefly. Father and son recognized each other. There were no dramatic orchestras, just a quiet moment of shock, then relief, then planning. They agreed on a simple strategy. Odysseus would return to the palace still disguised. Telemachus would endure the suitors' insults a little longer. Weapons would be removed from the main hall. Patience would be required. Odysseus entered his own home as a beggar. The suitors mocked him. One threw a stool. Another suggested he leave. Antinous, one of the more unpleasant suitors, struck him. Odysseus endured it, which may have been the hardest part of the entire journey. It is one thing to survive monsters. It is another to remain calm while someone insults you in your own dining room. Penelope heard about the stranger. She had grown cautious over the years. Hope had become a fragile thing. She invited the beggar to speak with her. In their conversation, Odysseus described himself carefully as someone who once met Odysseus. He gave details only she would recognize. Her composure held, but something shifted. A memory stirred. Still, she required proof. The next day, Penelope announced a contest. She would marry the man who could string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow through 12 aligned axe heads. It was a test designed with quiet precision. Few men could even lift the bow properly. The suitors tried. One by one, they strained. They adjusted their grips. They coughed. The bow did not bend. Finally, the beggar asked for a turn. The suitors protested. Telemachus intervened with just enough authority to allow it. The bow was placed in Odysseus's hands. He examined it calmly, ran his fingers along the wood. Then, without visible strain, he strung it in a single, smooth motion. The hall grew quiet in the way rooms do when reality begins to rearrange itself. He set the arrow, pulled the string, released. The arrow flew cleanly through all 12 axe heads. In that moment, the disguise was no longer necessary. Odysseus stood tall. Telemachus moved to his side. The doors were secured. The weapons had already been removed from the walls. The suitors realized, collectively and a little too late, that the long-absent king had returned. What followed was not chaos in the theatrical sense. It was swift, calculated, personal. Odysseus began with Antinous, an arrow through the throat. The hall erupted into panic. But panic is ineffective when the exits are closed and the rightful owner knows every corner of the room. Telemachus fought beside his father. Loyal servants assisted. The suitors fell one by one. The noise faded. When it was over, the palace was quiet again. Not peaceful, but quiet. Odysseus had crossed seas, spoken with the dead, endured gods, monsters, storms, and immortality. And yet, reclaiming his own home required the same qualities he had relied on all along: patience, strategy, and a refusal to announce himself too early. Penelope did not immediately embrace him. She remained cautious. She ordered the marriage bed moved. Odysseus reacted sharply. The bed could not be moved. He had carved one of its posts from a living olive tree rooted in the earth. It was immovable by design, a secret known only to them. That was the proof she needed. And so, after 20 years of war, wandering shipwrecks, livestock violations, and quiet endurance, Odysseus was finally home. The sea would still exist. The gods would still argue. But for the first time in a very long while, he was not drifting. The palace, after everything, required cleaning. This is one of the less discussed aspects of heroic restoration. When you reclaim a kingdom, there are practical matters. Furniture must be repositioned, floors must be washed, servants must be reassured. The goats, as always, remain emotionally unaffected. But peace in Greek mythology rarely arrives without paperwork from the gods. The families of the slain suitors were not delighted. Word traveled through Ithaca with remarkable speed. Fathers and brothers gathered in the public space, discussing justice in tones that suggested revenge. They argued that while the suitors had behaved badly, and they had, the scale of their demise felt excessive. A civil conflict began to simmer. Odysseus, who had only just resumed sleeping indoors, prepared again for violence. Telemachus stood beside him. Loyal servants armed themselves. It was beginning to look like a sequel nobody had requested. Before swords could fully clash, Athena intervened. She descended, not with thunder or dramatic music, but with authority. She demanded that both sides lay down arms. Zeus supported the decision. Lightning struck nearby as a helpful reminder, and just like that, the conflict ended. It is one of the more convenient conclusions in mythology. After 20 years of struggle, resolution arrived in a brief divine memo. Enough. Odysseus's reign resumed, quietly. There were fields to tend, laws to enforce, relationships to repair. Ithaca was not a vast empire. It did not require elaborate ceremonies. It required stability. But even here, the story does not entirely stop. Remember the prophecy of Tiresias, the warning that even after returning home, Odysseus would need to travel once more. He was told that he must carry an oar inland until he reached people who did not recognize it as a tool for the sea. There, he would plant it in the earth and make peace with Poseidon. It is a strangely poetic instruction. So at some point, after the palace was restored, after Penelope's long vigil ended, after Telemachus settled into adulthood, Odysseus likely walked away from the shoreline again. This time, not chased by storms, not pursued by monsters, just walking. He carried an oar on his shoulder. He moved inland, away from salt air and crashing waves, toward villages that had never seen the sea. Eventually, someone asked him why he carried a large flat piece of wood shaped like that. When they failed to recognize it, he knew he had reached the right place. There, he planted the oar, a small gesture of reconciliation with a god who had once made every horizon hostile. After that, his life is described more gently. A king aging in his own halls. A man no longer defined by movement, but by stillness. No more islands filled with sorceresses. No more caves with one-eyed hosts. Just time. Some traditions say he died peacefully. Others invent additional adventures, as if rest were too ordinary for him. But perhaps the most fitting ending is a quiet one. A man who once introduced himself as nobody finally returned to being someone very specific: husband, father, king. The journey of Odysseus is often told as an epic of monsters and gods, and it is. But it is also a story about delay, about endurance, about resisting the temptation to stop halfway, about surviving not through strength alone, but through thinking carefully when the room or the cave is dark. He left Ithaca as a confident ruler sailing toward war. He returned as something else, not broken, not triumphant in a loud way, just older, sharper, quieter. And perhaps that is the most human part of the entire myth. The sea remains. The stories remain. The name Odysseus drifts through centuries. But in the end, the longest journey was simply the slow, stubborn act of going home. And now, mercifully, he can sit down. And yet, because Greek mythology rarely allows a clean emotional fade-out, there are quieter ripples that continue after the sitting down. Once peace settled over Ithaca, at least the official Athena-approved version of peace, life resumed its ordinary rhythm, which, after 20 years of extraordinary inconvenience, must have felt almost suspicious. No monsters in the pantry, no gods hurling weather at the roof. Just mornings. Odysseus would wake in a real bed, the one carved from living olive wood, solid, rooted, immovable. It is difficult to overstate how meaningful that must have felt for someone who had spent years sleeping on sand, ship decks, forest floors, and occasionally enchanted islands where immortality was offered like a side dish. Penelope, for her part, had endured her own long campaign, not with swords or storms, but with patience. She had mastered the art of delay, which in some ways mirrors Odysseus's own specialty. While he navigated whirlpools, she navigated conversations. While he untied knots of wind, she untied her weaving at night. They were, in a quiet sense, evenly matched. Telemachus, now grown, would need guidance, not in how to survive monsters, but how to rule without becoming one. Odysseus had seen kings fall to arrogance, impatience, or simple carelessness. He had watched Agamemnon die because he trusted the wrong welcome. He had learned, sometimes painfully, that cleverness without restraint can irritate gods. It is tempting to imagine Odysseus as permanently restless, a man built for motion. But perhaps that is only how we prefer our heroes, always on the verge of departure. The older versions of the myth suggest something softer, that after planting the oar inland, after making peace with Poseidon, his final years were marked not by spectacle, but by stability. He would walk the rocky paths of Ithaca. He would inspect fields. He would listen to disputes over boundaries and goats and inheritance, problems far smaller than Cyclopes, yet somehow more persistent. He would age, gradually, without divine drama, and maybe, sometimes, he would look at the horizon, not with longing, not with dread, just recognition. The sea had been an adversary, a prison, a teacher. It had taken his men. It had tested his pride. It had shown him that shouting your name into the wind is rarely productive. And yet, without the sea, Odysseus would have remained simply a clever king of a small island. It was the long delay that shaped him into a story. The Odyssey, when told loudly, is about adventure. When told quietly, it is about time, about how years stretch, about how absence reshapes homes, about how survival sometimes depends on not revealing yourself too soon. He blinded a Cyclops, yes. He heard the Sirens sing. He walked among the dead. But he also waited. He endured. He chose repeatedly to keep moving when it would have been easier to surrender to comfort, whether that comfort came in the form of lotus fruit or immortality. And in the end, his reward was not glory. It was return, a small island, a faithful wife, a sun grown taller than memory, an olive tree rooted deep enough to hold a bed in place for decades. If you listen closely to the myth, not the crashing waves but the quieter spaces between them, you can hear something almost ordinary. A man trying to get home, taking longer than expected, making mistakes, fixing them slowly, learning that cleverness is useful, but humility keeps you alive. Odysseus does not end his story conquering new lands. He ends it in stillness, which may be the most difficult victory of all. And so, the ships are finally docked. The winds are tied up properly, the cattle remain uneaten, the bow rests unstrung. The sea continues its endless breathing, but for Odysseus at last, there is no need to answer it. He is home, and he stays. If we step back from the shoreline for a moment, just a small, careful step so we don't fall into another mythological inconvenience, the story of Odysseus begins to feel less like a parade of monsters and more like a prolonged lesson in consequences. Every major delay in his journey traces back to something very small. He boasts to Polyphemus. The sea becomes hostile. His men open a bag they were told not to open. The winds scatter them. They eat cattle explicitly labeled, "Do not eat." Lightning follows. Even the Trojan horse, that masterpiece of strategy, is a solution born from impatience. 10 years of stalemate ended not with honorable surrender, but with deception. It worked, but it also placed Odysseus firmly on the radar of gods who value order. Poseidon's anger is not random, it is personal. Odysseus blinded his son, then shouted about it. There is something deeply human in that impulse, to solve a problem cleverly and then ruin the elegance of the solution by announcing it too loudly. The Odyssey, told slowly, becomes a study in restraint, or rather, in the gradual acquisition of restraint. Early in the journey, Odysseus reveals his name with pride. Later, he hides his name to survive. As a beggar in his own hall, he absorbs insults without responding. That is not weakness. That is evolution. Even his encounter with Calypso is not about temptation in the dramatic sense. It is about the seductive nature of stopping. After years of chaos, stillness can feel like surrender. Immortality without home is simply endless drifting. He chooses mortality. He chooses aging. He chooses the bed carved from a rooted tree over eternal youth in a beautiful cave. That choice is quiet, but it is the center of the myth. We often remember the Sirens, their song, the ropes straining as Odysseus demands release. But the more interesting detail is that he ordered his men not to untie him, no matter what he said. He understood his own weakness. That is a subtle kind of intelligence, not just knowing how to outwit a Cyclops, but knowing when you cannot trust yourself. By the time he reaches Ithaca, Odysseus no longer needs to prove his cleverness. He moves slowly. He gathers information. He tests loyalty. He reveals himself only when control is assured. It is tempting to frame the slaughter of the suitors as triumphant, and perhaps it is, but it is also controlled, calculated. The chaos is brief because he has learned patience. And then, after reclaiming everything, he walks inland with an oar. There is something almost humorous about that final instruction. The man who crossed the Mediterranean multiple times must now carry a piece of it on his shoulder like a reminder, as if the sea insisted on leaving a mark. Planting the oar is symbolic, yes, but it is also practical, a gesture of peace, an admission that even the cleverest king cannot win an argument with the ocean forever. In many ways, Odysseus is not the strongest hero in Greek myth. He is not invincible. He is not morally spotless. He lies. He manipulates. He sometimes delays responsibility. But he persists. And perhaps that is why his story has endured longer than the roar of any individual monster. When you remove the drama, the shouting, the flashing swords, what remains is something oddly relatable. A person who wants to go home. A person who keeps being delayed. A person who learns, slowly, that the fastest way forward is often the most destructive. So he becomes slower, more careful, less eager to declare his name. By the end of the journey, Odysseus is no longer trying to outshine gods or impress strangers. He is trying to preserve something small and specific, his place. And that may be the most radical act in the entire epic. The sea still breathes, the winds still move, but Odysseus no longer answers every challenge with noise. Sometimes the cleverest thing to do is remain quiet. And finally, he does. If we allow the story to stretch just a little longer, gently, without urgency, we begin to see that Odysseus's journey is not only about distance, but about identity. When he left Ithaca, he was a king defined by reputation. He was known among the Greeks as the clever one, the strategist, the architect of the horse. His value rested in how others described him. But 20 years is a long time for a description to survive. During his wanderings, Odysseus repeatedly loses context. Among the lotus eaters, he is almost reduced to a man without memory. In the Cyclopes cave, he becomes nobody. On Circe's island, he risks becoming livestock. In the underworld, he is simply another shade speaking to the dead. On Calypso's island, he is nearly absorbed into immortality, detached from time itself. Each stop strips something away, not his intelligence, that remains, but the certainty of who he is. By the time he returns to Ithaca disguised as a beggar, he is performing a strange experiment. What remains of Odysseus when no one recognizes him? Eumaeus treats him kindly without knowing his name. Telemachus learns loyalty before recognition. Penelope demands proof, not legend. The identity of Odysseus must now be demonstrated, not assumed. That is a subtle shift. In Troy, his cleverness was a weapon. In Ithaca, it becomes a shield. He lies, but only strategically. He withholds information. He observes. The man who once announced himself to a Cyclops now understands the weight of silence. Even the famous bow test is not merely about strength. It is about recognition of rightful fit. Only Odysseus understands the tension of that bow intimately. Only he knows how it should feel in his hands. It is not brute force that strings it. It is familiarity. There is a quiet symmetry between the bow and the bed. Both are objects crafted by Odysseus himself. Both are immovable in their meaning. The bed rooted in the olive tree symbolizes permanence. The bow symbolizes authority. Neither responds to strangers. And so, when he strings the bow and reacts fiercely to the suggestion of moving the bed, he is not simply proving identity. He is reconnecting to something he built before the world interrupted him. That interruption, war, wandering, storms, did not erase him. It complicated him. Odysseus returns older, yes, but also smaller in some ways, less interested in being seen, more interested in being understood by the few who matter. Greek heroes often burn brightly and briefly. Achilles chooses glory over long life. Heracles labors dramatically. But Odysseus chooses endurance. He chooses the slow road. He chooses the possibility of sitting at his own table decades later. That choice requires patience greater than swinging a sword. And perhaps that is why the story continues to resonate. because most lives are not defined by a single battle. They are defined by persistence, by waiting, by adjusting plans when winds escape from bags. Odysseus is not flawless. He is impulsive. He is proud. He occasionally makes catastrophic announcements. But he learns. And learning, in myth as in life, is quieter than conquest. By the end, he has nothing left to prove to the sea, nothing left to prove to strangers, only relationships to repair, fields to maintain, a son to guide. It is almost anticlimactic, which makes it real. If you imagine him years later sitting outside his palace as the sun lowers over Ithaca, you can picture a man who once stood before Cyclopes and kings, now content with smaller conversations. The horizon still exists, but it no longer demands crossing. The Odyssey ends not with a roar, but with restoration, a home reclaimed, a bed unmoved, an oar planted inland, and a man who has finally learned when to speak and when to remain still. The waves continue their endless rhythm, but for Odysseus, the journey has reached its quiet conclusion. And if we sit with that quiet for just a little longer, something else becomes clear. The Odyssey is not really a story about getting home quickly. It is a story about why getting home slowly changes you. When Odysseus first sailed from Ithaca, he did so with confidence. He had allies, ships, weapons, a clear destination called Troy. Even war, in its own strange way, is structured. There are sides, objectives, timelines, at least in theory. But the return journey had none of that. No schedule, no certainty, no guarantees that morning would resemble evening. Each island reset the rules. Each god had personal preferences. Each mistake compounded into further delay. And yet, he kept adjusting. He did not defeat the sea. He adapted to it. He did not silence the gods. He negotiated around them. He did not overpower every obstacle. Sometimes he simply endured it until it passed. This is perhaps the most unglamorous quality of Odysseus: flexibility. When strength fails, he uses wit. When wit fails, he uses patience. When patience fails, he survives. And survival in mythology is rarely as celebrated as victory. We talk about the blinding of Polyphemus, but not about the long silence in the cave beforehand. We talk about the Sirens' song, but not about the uncomfortable hours tied to a mast. We talk about the slaughter of the suitors, but not about the weeks of insult he endured before acting. The Odyssey, when stripped of spectacle, is built from waiting, waiting for winds to settle, waiting for storms to pass, waiting for the right moment to reveal a name. Even Penelope's weaving mirrors this rhythm. She delays not through confrontation, but through repetition. Weave by day, unweave by night. Survival through subtle persistence. Odysseus and Penelope are not opposites. They are parallels. Both endure absence. Both resist pressure. Both refuse to collapse under expectation. And perhaps that is the deeper point of the myth. Not that cleverness wins, but that constancy endures. When Odysseus plants the oar inland, he symbolically acknowledges that even the sea must one day become memory. You cannot spend your entire life fighting waves. At some point, you must choose land. And land, unlike the sea, demands different skills: stewardship, stability, quiet authority. It is easy to romanticize wandering. Adventure looks impressive from a distance, but the Odyssey does not hide the cost of it. Men are lost. Years vanish. Parents die. Children grow up without you. By the time Odysseus returns, the world he left has shifted. He must fit into it again. And he does. Not loudly, not triumphantly, but deliberately. In the end, Odysseus's greatest achievement is not the Trojan horse or the escape from Scylla. It is restraint, the ability to sit at his own table without seeking the next horizon. The sea still calls. It always will. But he does not answer. The bow rests. The bed stands firm. The palace breathes quietly at night. And somewhere beyond the rocky cliffs of Ithaca, waves continue to rise and fall without his name attached to them. For the first time in decades, Odysseus is not a story moving forward. He is a story that has arrived, and arrival, after so much delay, is a surprisingly gentle ending. If we allow the story to settle fully, like dust after a long voyage, we begin to notice something almost understated about Odysseus. He survives not because he is untouchable. He survives because he changes. At the beginning of his journey, he believes intelligence is enough. Outsmart the enemy. Outsmart the monster. Outsmart the gods, if necessary. And for a while, that works. But intelligence without humility draws storms. It takes years, literal decades, for him to learn that cleverness must be paired with silence, that strength must sometimes remain concealed, that revealing your name to the wrong audience is more dangerous than facing a giant. Odysseus does not begin as a quiet man. He becomes one. And this transformation is so gradual that it almost disappears beneath the surface of the adventure. But if you trace the arc carefully, the loud strategist of Troy evolves into the patient observer of Ithaca. When he returns home, he does not burst through the palace doors announcing victory. He enters in disguise. He listens. He measures the room. He waits for the correct alignment, much like the arrow through the axe heads. That arrow is symbolic, yes, but it is also precise. It requires stillness, a steady hand, control. By the end of the Odyssey, Odysseus has mastered something far more difficult than combat. He has mastered timing, and timing, unlike strength, cannot be forced. Even the gods eventually allow him to rest, not because he defeats them, but because he endures long enough for conflict to exhaust itself. Athena intervenes not for spectacle, but for closure. Zeus signals that enough is enough. The chaos quiets. What remains is a man who has seen too much to be easily impressed, a man who has walked through the underworld and returned not triumphant, but reflective. If you imagine Odysseus years after the epic ends, he is not retelling stories loudly at feasts. He is sitting slightly apart, perhaps listening more than speaking. The younger generation may ask about Cyclopes and Sirens. He might answer, briefly, without embellishment. Because once you have survived the sea, you do not need to exaggerate it. The Odyssey reminds us that journeys are rarely linear. They loop, they stall, they punish impatience, they test loyalty, they reveal weaknesses you did not know you had, and sometimes they strip away the illusion that control was ever yours to begin with. Odysseus leaves Ithaca as a king confident in his reputation. He returns as a man aware of his limits. That awareness is not defeat. It is maturity. The sea remains vast. The gods remain unpredictable. The world remains beyond full understanding. But Ithaca, small, rocky, unimpressive to outsiders, becomes enough. And that may be the quietest lesson of all. You can cross the edges of the known world. You can hear divine songs. You can speak with the dead. But eventually, the most meaningful act is to sit still where you belong. No more disguises, no more drifting, no more shouting your name into open water, just a rooted bed, a familiar table, a horizon that no longer demands crossing. The story of Odysseus ends not with thunder, but with steadiness. And after 20 years of movement, steadiness is more than victory. It is peace. And if we stretch the quiet just a little further, past the official ending, past the planted oar and the restored palace, we find something even softer hiding inside the myth. Because the Odyssey is not only about Odysseus, it is also about absence. For 20 years, Ithaca functioned without him. Fields were harvested, storms came and went. Telemachus learned to walk, then to speak, then to question. Penelope learned how to answer questions without answering them. Servants chose loyalty or betrayal. Time does not pause for heroes. This is perhaps the most unsettling part of the story. Odysseus experiences his journey as continuous struggle. But for those at home, the struggle is slower, quieter, less dramatic. Waiting is its own voyage. Penelope's weaving becomes a metaphor not just for delay, but for endurance. Each thread pulled by day, undone by night, mirrors the sea's own rhythm, advance and retreat. She cannot fight the suitors directly. She cannot overpower them, so she manipulates time itself. Telemachus, meanwhile, grows up under pressure. The son of a legend must live in a house where that legend is constantly questioned. He must decide whether to defend a memory or accept its disappearance. When he travels in search of news, he is not seeking adventure. He is seeking confirmation that his father is not just a story. Odysseus's return, therefore, restores more than a throne. It restores continuity. But restoration does not erase the years. It cannot return Telemachus to childhood. It cannot give Penelope back the nights of uncertainty. It cannot resurrect the men lost at sea. The Odyssey does not pretend otherwise. There is loss in every stage of the journey, loss of companions, loss of innocence, loss of certainty. Even Odysseus loses parts of himself. The impulsive braggart who taunted Polyphemus does not fully survive into old age. The man who returns to Ithaca is tempered, sharpened, yes, but also restrained. In many myths, heroes return unchanged, as if adventure merely confirms their greatness. Odysseus is different. He is altered by delay. He learns that not every challenge requires confrontation, that sometimes survival depends on concealment, that sometimes the bravest act is silence. The sea, throughout the epic, functions almost like a mirror. When Odysseus is arrogant, it rages. When he is patient, it carries him. It reflects his internal shifts. And by the end, when he plants the oar inland, he symbolically moves beyond that reflection. He no longer needs the sea to define him. This is the quiet evolution at the heart of the myth. Odysseus begins as a man eager to prove himself among other heroes. He ends as a man content to remain in one place. That contentment is not flashy. It does not inspire statues or battle songs, but it sustains. And perhaps that is why the Odyssey has endured for millennia, not because of the monsters, but because of the waiting, because of the recognition that life is rarely a straight line, because of the understanding that identity is shaped as much by delay as by achievement. In the final image, we do not see Odysseus on a ship. We see him on land, rooted, like the olive tree that holds his bed, unmoved by passing winds. The waves continue their endless conversation with the shore, but for Odysseus, the conversation is over. He has crossed enough horizons. And finally, after so much motion, he allows himself to remain still. If we continue to let the story breathe very slowly, like the tide moving in and out without urgency, we begin to notice that the Odyssey is also about scale At sea, everything is enormous. Storms are overwhelming, waves are towering, monsters are physically gigantic, gods are immeasurable. The world feels vast, unstable, and beyond human control. On Ithaca, everything is small: a woven cloth, a carved bedpost, a single bow, a dining hall, a father and son speaking quietly in a hut. The epic moves from vastness to intimacy, and that shift may be the true resolution. Odysseus survives the large things, but he lives for the small ones. When he chooses to leave Calypso's island, he is choosing a mortal life of finite, ordinary details over infinite perfection. He is choosing weathered stone over eternal youth, choosing a wife who has aged alongside him rather than a goddess who never will. It is not a glamorous decision. It is a grounded one. The myth subtly suggests that immortality without belonging is emptiness, that eternity without context is drifting forever. Odysseus does not want endless horizons. He wants one specific shoreline. Throughout his journey, names shift. He is king, warrior, captain, nobody, guest, beggar. But at the end, he returns to the most difficult role of all, himself. And that self is no longer loud. When he first reveals his name to Polyphemus, it is an act of pride. When he finally reveals himself to Penelope, it is an act of trust. The difference between those two moments defines the entire arc of the story. One revelation creates chaos. The other creates restoration. The Odyssey, told gently, becomes a meditation on recognition. Who sees you? Who knows you? Who waits for you long enough to confirm your identity? The suitors see only a throne. The Cyclopes sees only food. Calypso sees a companion. Athena sees potential. Penelope sees proof. And Odysseus, over time, learns to see himself more clearly, not as the cleverest man in the room, not as the hero of Troy, but as someone capable of error, growth, restraint. The journey strips away the illusion that he controls everything. The sea repeatedly demonstrates otherwise. Each storm is a reminder that power is conditional, but within those conditions, he adapts. He becomes quieter, and in that quiet, something stabilizes. The Odyssey ends not with Odysseus conquering the world, but with him narrowing it, choosing boundaries, accepting limits. The horizon, once a challenge, becomes background. The bed carved from the olive tree remains immovable because it is rooted in something living. It cannot be carried away. It cannot be shifted without destroying it. That bed is the opposite of a ship. Ships are built to move. Beds are built to remain. Odysseus spends 20 years on ships. He ends his story beside a bed. There is a calm symmetry in that. The sea continues endlessly, as it always has. But Odysseus no longer belongs to it. He belongs to a place. And that belonging, after so much distance, is the quietest triumph of all. No more disguises, no more storms, no more proving, just presence. And for a hero of wandering, presence is enough. If we keep moving gently through the quiet aftermath, we start to notice that the Odyssey is also about memory, how it stretches, distorts, and sometimes quietly preserves what matters. For 20 years, Odysseus existed in stories rather than in presence. On Ithaca, he became a rumor, a possibility, a name spoken in past tense, then cautiously in present tense, then sometimes not at all. Memory can keep someone alive, but it can also turn them into something simplified. To the suitors, Odysseus was an obstacle that had likely dissolved into bones somewhere far away. To Telemachus, he was a legend inherited rather than experienced. To Penelope, he was both a husband and a question mark. Meanwhile, Odysseus himself carried memories of Ithaca that had frozen in time. He remembered Penelope as she was 20 years earlier. He remembered his son as a child. He remembered his halls untouched. Returning home required both sides to update those memories. This is a quiet but important challenge. When he finally stands before Penelope, even after the bow is strung and the suitors lie still, she hesitates, not because she doubts the evidence, but because 20 years changes people. Memory is not the same as presence. Her final test, the immovable bed, bridges that gap. It is not about strength. It is about shared knowledge, a secret rooted in craftsmanship and intimacy. The bed, carved from a living olive tree, becomes the anchor point between past and present. It proves that something created before the long absence still exists, unchanged. But Odysseus himself is not unchanged. The man who left for Troy could not have endured Calypso's island for 7 years without transformation. The young king who boasted to Polyphemus could not have calmly endured insults as a beggar. The Odyssey quietly insists that identity is not static. It evolves under pressure. Even the gods shift in their responses. Athena guides him repeatedly, but she does not eliminate his suffering. Zeus permits storms, but eventually permits rest. Poseidon rages, but does not destroy him entirely. The divine world mirrors the human one, complex, reactive, occasionally petty, but ultimately moving toward balance. When Odysseus plants the oar inland, he symbolically redefines his relationship with memory. The sea becomes something behind him rather than beneath him, a past chapter rather than an ongoing trial. And Ithaca, once remembered from afar, becomes immediate again. Real soil, real stone, real conversations. Perhaps the most understated moment in the epic is not the battle in the hall, but the night after. The palace finally quiet, the doors closed, the torches dimmed. Odysseus and Penelope speaking, not as mythic figures, but as two people who have endured separate hardships. There is no spectacle in that image, only relief. The Odyssey does not end with expansion. It ends with containment, a narrowing of focus, a shrinking of scale from world-spanning adventure to domestic restoration. And that shrinking is not loss. It is completion. Odysseus does not need another horizon. He has already crossed enough. In the silence of Ithaca, after the storms and disguises and prophecies, what remains is something remarkably simple. A man, a home, a life resumed. The waves continue somewhere beyond the cliffs, repeating their endless rhythm. But Odysseus no longer listens for opportunity in their sound. He listens for stability, and for the first time in decades, stability answers back. And if we sit with that stability just a little longer, we begin to understand that the Odyssey is also about proportion. At sea, every problem feels enormous. A storm can erase months of progress. A single decision can cost lives. A moment of pride can summon a god. Everything is amplified. But on Ithaca, problems shrink to human scale, a dispute over land, a question of loyalty, a marriage tested by time. These are not dramatic in the mythic sense. They do not involve whirlpools or singing creatures perched on rocks, and yet they are more difficult because monsters are external. Restoration is internal. Odysseus knew how to blind a Cyclops. He knew how to escape a cave. He knew how to lash himself to a mast. But rebuilding trust after absence requires a different skill set entirely. Penelope does not immediately collapse into his arms. She verifies him, carefully, quietly. She has survived too long on caution to abandon it instantly. Telemachus must learn how to rule alongside a father he barely knows. Servants must adjust from surviving opportunistically to serving legitimately. The palace is physically reclaimed in a single night, but emotionally it requires time. And time in this story is the true force at work. 10 years of war, 10 years of wandering, 7 years on an island of immortality, months drifting, days disguised. The Odyssey is structured around duration, not speed. Odysseus's greatest enemy was not the Cyclopes. It was delay, and delay reshapes everything. By the end of the journey, he no longer tries to rush events. When Athena tells him to wait before revealing himself, he waits. When planning the confrontation with the suitors, he times it precisely. When speaking to Penelope, he allows her doubt space to resolve. This is not the same man who once shouted his name across open water. The early Odysseus wants recognition. The later Odysseus understands that recognition earned quietly is more durable. Even the act of planting the oar inland is about proportion. It removes the sea from dominance. It places the ocean into context. Important, powerful, but no longer central. He has measured the vastness of the world. Now he measures his own boundaries, and those boundaries are enough. The Odyssey, when told loudly, is an epic of spectacle. But when told slowly, when each wave is allowed to roll in and out, it becomes a meditation on returning to scale, on accepting that you cannot control storms, on understanding that cleverness has limits, on realizing that home is not impressive from a distance, but indispensable up close. Odysseus does not retire into legend. He retires into ordinariness. And that ordinariness, after everything, is extraordinary. No more disguises, no more divine negotiations, no more monsters waiting behind doors, just the steady rhythm of days passing without catastrophe. The horizon still exists, but it no longer pulls at him. The sea can keep its storms. Odysseus has chosen land, and land, unlike the sea, does not require proving yourself every morning. It simply asks you to remain. And at last, he does. If we linger even longer, allowing the night in Ithaca to deepen and the torches to dim, something else becomes visible beneath the surface of the myth. The Odyssey is not only about returning home, it is about learning what home actually means. When Odysseus left, Ithaca was a place he ruled, a territory, a responsibility, a crown. It was something he possessed. When he returns, Ithaca is no longer something to own. It is something to belong to. That difference is subtle, but it changes everything. At sea, Odysseus was constantly confronted with forces larger than himself. Gods, nature, fate. The illusion of control was dismantled repeatedly. Each shipwreck chipped away at certainty. Each island forced adaptation. The sea humbled him, and humility is rarely immediate. It arrives gradually, disguised as inconvenience. By the time he stands in his own hall, disguised as a beggar, he is not testing only the suitors. He is testing himself. Can he endure insult without reacting? Can he restrain power until the precise moment? Can he move without announcing himself? The early Odysseus likely would have answered no to at least one of those questions. The later Odysseus answers yes. And that shift, more than any monster, defines the journey. Even his choice to reject Calypso's immortality reveals a recalibration of desire. Immortality is tempting. It eliminates uncertainty. It removes decay. It solves the problem of time. But it also removes context. Odysseus does not want endless existence. He wants specific existence. He wants Penelope, not perfection. He wants Ithaca, not infinity. He wants a bed rooted in living wood, not eternal drifting in paradise. In mythology, gods are immortal but restless. Humans are mortal but rooted. Odysseus chooses the second path consciously. This is not framed as heroic. It is framed as necessary. And perhaps that is why the ending feels so quiet. Because the real climax of the Odyssey is not the arrow through the axe heads. It is the decision to stop wandering. The sea always offers movement. There is always another island, another story, another horizon promising significance. But Odysseus finally understands that endless movement is not freedom. It is instability. Stability, on the other hand, requires acceptance of limits, of aging, of mortality, of repetition. He has lived through extraordinary variation. Now he chooses repetition. The same sunrise over Ithaca's cliffs, the same paths through the hills, the same voices in the palace. For someone who once crossed the edges of the known world, repetition becomes comfort. And in that comfort, the epic dissolves into something almost domestic. Odysseus does not need applause. He does not need another war. He does not need to test himself against the horizon. He has already proven enough. The waves continue beyond the cliffs, indifferent as always. They do not celebrate his return. They do not mourn his departure from their domain. They simply move. But Odysseus no longer follows. He stands on land, rooted. And after 20 years of uncertainty, being rooted is the greatest victory he will ever claim. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. And that quiet is where the story finally rests. If we let the silence stretch even further, long enough for the night insects of Ithaca to hum softly beyond the palace walls, we begin to notice that the Odyssey is, at its deepest layer, about limits. Early in his life, Odysseus believed limits were obstacles. A wall, climb it. A monster, blind it. A war, outsmart it. But the sea introduced him to a different kind of limit. You cannot outsmart a storm once it has begun. You cannot argue with a whirlpool. You cannot persuade lightning to choose another target. The sea does not negotiate. It reminds. And reminder, over time, becomes understanding. By the final chapters of his life, Odysseus no longer treats limits as enemies. He accepts them as boundaries within which he must operate. That shift from resistance to recognition is subtle, but it is the quiet turning point of the entire myth. When he is tied to the mast to hear the sirens, he acknowledges a limit within himself. He knows he will want to leap toward the song, so he prepares for his own weakness in advance. That is not just cleverness, that is self-knowledge. When he enters his palace disguised, he accepts that identity is fragile without proof. He does not demand recognition. He earns it. When he plants the oar inland, he accepts that the sea will always be larger than him. He does not conquer Poseidon. He makes peace. And peace, in Greek myth, is often harder than victory. The Odyssey could have ended with Odysseus seeking more glory, another expedition, another challenge. But instead, it narrows, it slows, it rests. This is unusual for epic literature. Most heroes burn brightly until they fall. Odysseus does something quieter. He dims intentionally. He chooses to become smaller than his legend. He becomes a man who wakes up and attends to ordinary matters, who resolves disputes about land, who ages, who understands that the world does not need to revolve around his name. There is something deeply human in that arc, because most lives are not a sequence of dramatic battles. They are a long process of adjustment, of learning where you cannot push further, of deciding when enough is enough. The young Odysseus wanted to be known. The older Odysseus wants to remain. That difference is everything. Even the olive tree that anchors his bed teaches the same lesson. Its strength comes not from movement, but from depth. Roots hold it in place through storms. Ships survive by moving. Trees survive by staying. Odysseus begins as a ship. He ends as a tree, rooted in Ithaca's soil, shaped by storms but no longer chasing them. And perhaps that is the quiet message beneath all the monsters and prophecies. Adventure transforms you, but stability defines you. The sea will always exist, vast and restless. But Odysseus no longer needs to test himself against it. He has learned his measure. He has learned that identity is not proven by distance traveled, but by where you finally choose to stand. And so, in the final image of the Odyssey, not the loud version but the slow one, we see a man sitting outside his palace at dusk. No armor, no disguises, no urgency, just the steady presence of someone who has reached his boundary and accepted it. The waves continue their endless motion beyond the cliffs. But Odysseus does not follow. He remains. And in remaining, he becomes complete. If we continue a little further, softly, carefully, without disturbing the calm, we might notice something almost paradoxical about Odysseus. For a man remembered as a wanderer, his story is ultimately about returning to the same place he started. He does not found a new kingdom. He does not conquer a distant land. He does not expand his territory. He circles outward for 20 years and comes back to a small rocky island that outsiders would likely overlook. Ithaca is not grand. It does not rival Troy in wealth. It does not command vast armies. It does not sit at the center of trade routes. It is modest, and yet, for Odysseus, it is sufficient. There is something quietly radical in that sufficiency. Many heroes in myth are defined by expansion, bigger victories, larger territories, louder legacies. But Odysseus's triumph is contraction. He reduces his world deliberately. At the beginning of the epic, his horizon is wide and restless. At the end, his horizon is simply the line where sea meets sky, observed, not pursued. The transformation is internal. He no longer measures himself by how far he can travel. He measures himself by how firmly he can remain. The sea tested his endurance. The gods tested his patience. Time tested his identity. And all three left marks. But those marks do not push him back toward wandering. They pull him toward grounding. Even the violence in the hall, the confrontation with the suitors, is not about dominance. It is about restoration. Once order is reestablished, there is no further conquest, no expansion campaign, no desire to display power beyond necessity. The energy dissipates, and what replaces it is stillness. Stillness can feel anticlimactic in a story filled with storms, but stillness is the achievement, because stillness requires that the internal storm has settled. When Odysseus first sailed away, he believed cleverness could control the world. By the end, he understands that the world does not require controlling, only navigating. And navigation eventually leads home. The olive tree bed remains one of the most telling symbols. It is carved from something alive and rooted. It cannot be moved without destroying its structure. It exists because someone once chose to build around what was already there. That bed represents integration. The sea is movement without anchor. The bed is anchor without movement. Odysseus has experienced both, and he chooses the latter. If we imagine him in old age, we do not see him pacing the shore anxiously. We see him seated, watching the light change over the hills, perhaps occasionally remembering the Sirens' song, but without longing. The song no longer pulls at him. He has heard it. He has survived it. He does not need to return to it. The Odyssey, told slowly, becomes less about adventure and more about alignment. A man aligning with his limits, with his place, with his time. He began as someone eager to be remembered. He ends as someone content to belong. The sea continues beyond the cliffs, endlessly restless. But Odysseus is no longer restless. He is home, and he stays. And if we allow the story to soften even more until it almost dissolves into the sound of distant waves, we can see that the Odyssey is also about recognition of scale within a life. At 20, the world feels large and unfinished. Horizons feel like invitations. Every distant shore seems meaningful, simply because it is distant. Odysseus left Ithaca with that expansive energy. There was war to fight, glory to secure, reputation to maintain. The world was something to test himself against. But over time, the scale shifts. After enough storms, the horizon stops looking like possibility and starts looking like repetition. After enough losses, survival begins to feel more important than legend. After enough years, returning becomes more urgent than expanding. The sea does not change. Odysseus does. That is the quiet truth beneath the myth. The Cyclopes remains large. The Sirens remain seductive. The whirlpool remains dangerous. But the man encountering them evolves. He becomes less interested in proving himself against them. By the time he reaches Ithaca, the scale of importance has inverted. The palace dining hall matters more than the vast ocean. A single bed matters more than an immortal island. A conversation with Penelope matters more than the praise of distant kings. The Odyssey narrows deliberately, and in that narrowing, it finds meaning. There is something profoundly human in that arc, because most lives begin outward and end inward. We explore, we test, we expand, and then gradually we contract toward what is essential. Odysseus's essential thing is Ithaca, not because it is impressive, not because it is powerful, but because it is his. Ownership shifts to belonging, ambition shifts to continuity, movement shifts to presence. When he plants the oar inland, it is not just a gesture of peace with Poseidon. It is a final acknowledgement that he does not need to carry the sea any further into his identity. The sea becomes history, and history no longer dictates his next step. The gods fall silent. The storms recede. The horizon stabilizes into background, and Odysseus, once defined by motion, allows himself to be defined by stillness. This is not the kind of ending that produces fireworks. It produces quiet evenings, familiar meals, predictable sunrises. But predictability after chaos is luxury. The Odyssey ends not with applause, but with balance restored. A man who once crossed the edges of the known world now walks familiar paths without urgency. He no longer needs to test himself. He no longer needs to declare himself. He simply remains. And in remaining, he completes the circle that began 20 years earlier on the same shore. The waves continue their endless rhythm beyond the cliffs. But for Odysseus, the rhythm that matters is slower now. Steady, rooted, enough. And as the story draws even closer to stillness, we begin to notice one final, almost invisible thread running through the entire journey. The Odyssey is about returning not to who you were, but to who you can now be. Odysseus did not come back unchanged. He could not. 20 years is too long. Too many nights under unfamiliar stars. Too many voices, divine, monstrous, mournful, whispering in caves and on shores. The man who left Ithaca believed that wit alone could shape outcomes. The man who returned understood that outcomes often shape you instead. This difference is quiet, but decisive. Early in the journey, Odysseus responds to challenges with assertion. Later, he responds with observation. The early version announces himself. The later version waits to be recognized. Even his reunion with Penelope is not explosive. It is deliberate, measured. She tests him. He responds not with offense, but with explanation. Their bond is restored not through force, but through shared memory. That is maturity. The myth never explicitly says, Odysseus learned humility. It simply shows him acting with it. And humility is rarely loud. By the time the oar is planted inland, the great wanderer has accepted that his story does not need to continue escalating. There will be no greater monster than time itself, no more dramatic opponent than absence. The largest forces he faced were not Cyclopes or whirlpools. They were delay, loss, uncertainty, and he endured them. Endurance is not glamorous. It does not shimmer like armor. It does not echo like battle cries. It is quiet, repetitive, patient, but it sustains. The Odyssey survives in memory not because of its noise, but because of its arc, because it begins with ambition and ends with acceptance, because it expands into chaos and contracts into calm. Odysseus becomes less concerned with being extraordinary. He becomes concerned with being present. The palace that once felt like something to defend now feels like something to inhabit. The bed rooted in olive wood is no longer proof of identity. It is a place to rest within it. The sea continues its endless motion beyond the cliffs. It does not stop simply because one man has finished traveling it. But Odysseus no longer feels summoned by it. He has answered enough calls. In the final quiet image, we do not see him preparing another ship. We do not see him scanning maps. We see him seated, breathing, aging, existing within the rhythm of a small island that has waited long enough. The legend remains, but the man becomes ordinary again, and that ordinariness is not loss of greatness. It is the completion of it. He began as a name shouted across water. He ends as a presence felt within walls. No storms, no disguises, no proving, just a life resumed, altered, tempered, quieter. And in that quiet, the Odyssey finally comes to rest, not with a crash of waves, but with the steady, almost imperceptible sound of someone who has stopped moving and chosen to stay. And now, if we let the story settle completely, like a ship finally docked after too many uncertain tides, we reach the gentlest truth of all. The Odyssey is not about conquering the world. It is about surviving it long enough to come home. Odysseus began his journey surrounded by other heroes, defined by comparison. Stronger than some, weaker than others, smarter than most. His identity was relational, measured against rivals, enemies, allies. But when he drifted alone on broken timber, stripped of ships and soldiers, none of those comparisons mattered. There was only him. The sea removed witnesses, it removed applause, it removed reputation, and what remained was endurance. That endurance carried him through islands where memory dissolved, through caves where identity had to be hidden, through halls where pride had to be swallowed. Each stage of the journey simplified him, not into weakness, into clarity. By the time he sits again in Ithaca, He does not need the world to confirm who he is. He no longer seeks recognition from giants or gods. He no longer measures himself by how far he can travel. He measures himself by how firmly he can remain. The great irony of Odysseus is that his fame rests on movement, but his fulfillment rests on stillness. The sea is vast, restless, eternal. Ithaca is small, rocky, finite. He chooses the small thing. He chooses the mortal thing. He chooses the rooted bed carved from living wood over endless drifting beneath immortal skies. And that choice is not dramatic. It is quiet. The waves beyond the cliffs continue their endless rhythm, indifferent to human stories. The gods turn their attention elsewhere. The storms gather over distant waters. But Odysseus no longer answers every disturbance. He has learned the most difficult lesson of all. Not every horizon needs to be crossed. Sometimes the bravest act is staying where you belong. In the final image, if we slow it down enough, we see no armor, no bow, no disguise. Just a man who has walked far enough. A man who has learned when to speak and when to remain silent. A man who once introduced himself as nobody and eventually became fully himself by returning home. The Odyssey does not end with thunder. It ends with breath, steady, even unremarkable. And after 20 years of storms, that unremarkable breath is the greatest victory of all. So the ships remain docked. The oar stays planted, the bed stands rooted, and Odysseus at last rests quietly.